Just a little bit.
Moちょっと暗くします。
Good morning, colleagues. We will start in a few minutes. We will have what I think will be a very interactive session, and therefore I would ask you all to sit in the middle part, because we will, our moderator will explain how we're going to do it, but we're going to allow questions throughout the session, I think. So that in order for that to be done nicely and smooth, I would ask all of you to sit in the middle part of the hall. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming so early in the morning. So just a few days ago, the UN Secretary General had a very gloomy assessment of the world today. He talked about chaos, he talked about unraveling of the world order. And a few days later, the world leaders met at the UN Security Council, and the topic of that meeting was chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, their proliferation, and how they are moved around. So the topic of this panel, New Ways of Conflict, couldn't be more timely. And we have some great panelists here with us this morning. Joe Husbands, a scholar with the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and Andrew Feinstein, Executive Director of Corruption Watch, an NGO that exposes the impact of bribery and corruption on democracy. He's also a former member of the ANC in South Africa and author of several books. Unfortunately, we had two other panelists, General Jérôme Dallaire and Mohamed Mohamedou. They couldn't make it at the last minute. So we're going to make this panel a little bit different. First, we're going to have both Andrew and Joe make their opening statement, and then we're going to go into the conversation. But if any one of you throughout the panel wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we will give you the time to ask that question at any time throughout the next hour and a half. So, Andrew, if you want to start.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. The argument I want to make is that while the nature of warfare and as a consequence, the modalities of warfare are in a process of almost unprecedented change, a lot of the politics and economics that inform warfare and the global trade in weaponry that is such an important component of warfare remain very much the same. So what I'm going to do is try and sketch some of the defining features of the global trade in weapons and the ways in which it affects warfare and the consequences, therefore, of warfare. Now, I think the starting point has to be that the trade in weapons is an important dimension of national defense, a tool of foreign policy, both licit and illicit, and a contributor, although I would argue massively overstated, to national and the global economy. It is my contention that the arms trade, big and small, has additional profound impacts on the world, from the enabling, fueling, and perpetuation of conflict and repression, the undermining of development and economic progress, to the corrosion of democracy. I've spent the last 17 years investigating the nature and impacts of the global trade in arms, since I tried as an ANC Member of Parliament to investigate a massive and massively corrupt arms deal that my own government undertook in South Africa in 1999, a deal that had enormous impacts on our very young democracy. I suppose, if it was possible to do such a thing, the summary of this work is contained in a book I wrote called The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, which I'm delighted to say has also been translated into Japanese. The book has then been made into a feature documentary, and to give you some sense of the sort of universe that I cover in the work and in the film, I thought we could perhaps show a very brief couple of minutes trailer of the film.
I've got nothing against money. I don't mind paying bribes to politicians. The thing about politicians is that they're very much like prostitutes, but only more expensive.
The heads of government are the salespeople in chief of their country's large arms contractors.
For the last 50 years at least, policy has been made based on the assumption of greed, and it's ruined the world.
This very phrase, war on terror, is nonsense. It's like saying a war on war. You're slipping into this possibility of kind of perpetual war.
The national security state not only seeks a perpetual state of war, it will even go to all ends to create that.
They make the mafia look like a bunch of schoolboys.
It destroys diplomacy. It destroys the will to diplomacy, and it destroys the skill for diplomacy.
Bombs, they're like food. Munitions, that's what, sell by that. You gotta get rid of it.
Blair came to South Africa to lobby that BAE, the British weapons manufacturer, won the biggest contract, $10 billion. Quite scarce public resources on this weaponry that we didn't need. And this is the template around the world.
BAE channeled international covert payments all over the world to the local politicians.
Seems to be a very expensive way of organising bribe payment. Might as well cut out the military equipment and just hand out the money.
It's the disease of permanent war that destroyed the Middle East, not Islamic fundamentalism.
Companies are not only sort of part of the government, but they're effectively above the law.
It's okay to kill from a distance without a warrant, without a trial, without a jury, and the execution takes place off screen.
Once you start a war, you open a kind of Pandora's box. You don't control it, it controls you. And it propels you in directions you never thought you'd go.
I think the first thing to make clear, because this is incredibly important as we start to consider new and emerging forms of warfare and conflict, is that arms deals stretch across a continuum of legality and ethics, from the official or formal trade to what are referred to as the grey and black markets, what I call the shadow world. So the grey market alludes to deals that are conducted through legal channels, but undertaken covertly. They are often utilized by governments to impact foreign policy illicitly. Black market deals are illegal in conception and execution. But crucially, in practice, the reality is that the boundaries between these three markets are extremely fuzzy. They are often intertwined and dependent on each other. With bribery and corruption commonplace, there are very few arms transactions that do not involve an element of illegality, most often through intermediaries, middlemen, agents, or dealers. In fact, like the gentleman who has particularly strong views about politicians, an arms dealer called Ricardo Privatera, there are many such dealers and agents who provide services to large defense companies and governments while continuing to operate in the black and grey markets. And these black and grey deals frequently contravene arms embargoes, national and multilateral laws, agreements and regulation. And the reason that this is so easy to do is because the trade in weapons is characterized by almost blanket national security imposed secrecy. And coupled with that, it is an area of trade that operates with a remarkable degree of legal impunity. So as Professor James Stewart's research team at the University of British Columbia established, as at around the end of 2011, when the first edition of the book came out, of the approximately 502 violations of UN arms embargoes, there are only 2 instances where this has led to legal accountability of any sort whatsoever. And only 1 case led to prosecution and the payment of a fine that was a small fraction of the arms deal involved. So those involved in the trade operate in something of a parallel legal universe, where they seldom face the legal consequences of their actions, which in turn are justified in the name of national security. In a remarkable piece of work, Joe Roger of Transparency International at the time calculated that the trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade. An American Department of Commerce study put that figure at 53%. As a consequence of this, and the fact that corruption often leads to the purchase of inappropriate or simply the wrong equipment, the trade in weapons often undermines rather than enhances security. And the key to understanding this extraordinary situation are the linkages between the trade in weapons and the political process. So, weapons manufacturers, both as companies and as individuals, are massive contributors to political parties, to political campaigns, and often individually to politicians. There exists in this industry, perhaps more so than in any other, a revolving door between government, the military, intelligence agencies, departments of foreign affairs, and the weapons makers themselves, the companies. So let me try and draw out some of these impacts. On the case that I try to investigate in South Africa, in which our young democracy decided to spend $10 billion on weapons for which the country had absolutely no use, simply because bribes of between $350 and $400 million were paid to key ministers who made the decision about what to buy and who to buy it from, key officials within the military and within government service, and very sadly to political parties as well, including my own political party, the ANC. Not only did South Africa have no use of these weapons, many of which have never been utilized, but remarkably, the head of the Air Force in South Africa had to come to Parliament to say, as a consequence of these arms deals, and specifically the purchase of fighter jets and trainer jets, the Air Force had no budget for the equipment that it actually needed, which was transport planes to deal with peacekeeping missions in southern and sub-Saharan Africa, and to deal with the consequences of natural disasters. But the impacts of this deal were far more wide-reaching and profound than that. Our recent former president, Jacob Zuma, faced 783 counts of fraud, corruption, and racketeering in relation to that deal. The charges were dropped a few weeks before he was elected president by a prosecutor who a few weeks after the election was made a High Court judge. The consequence of that was that South Africa's nascent democracy was undermined by a perception that the use of state contracts to make material gains personally and as a political party was acceptable. President Jacob Zuma was forced out of office after 8 years in which he and his family looted the country of billions and billions of dollars. South Africa is fortunate in that the rule of law has finally predominated, and Jacob Zuma will go on trial late this year or early next year. But in addition to that, at the time of this arms deal, our then newly elected President Thabo Mbeki claimed that we did not have the finances to provide antiretroviral medication to the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. According to a very conservative study undertaken at the School of Public Health, the Kennedy School of Governance at Harvard, as a consequence of that policy choice, over the next 5 years, 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths. 35,000 babies were born HIV positive every year for 5 years because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment. But we could afford to spend $10 billion on weapons. In a very recent case involving a big Anglo-Italian weapons manufacturer, and which you can find on our website at cw-uk.org, we have seen a situation where a company sold equipment to 2 countries where that equipment did not meet the basic technical specifications and requirements of the contracts, simply because the company had bribed the procurement officials overseeing the contracts. And those bribes compelled them to change the technical criteria to something that the company could deliver. So 2 countries have each spent almost $3 billion on military helicopters that they cannot use because they cannot perform the functions for which they were bought. So even if one takes a very narrow conception of national security, which I do not, the nature of the trade in weapons actually undermines the very security and defense that it is supposed to be bolstering. If one looks to a broader paradigm of what security actually comprises, beyond just the military, the reality is that because of the inordinate amounts of money and the corruption implicit in it, the arms trade ensures that almost always conflict is the preferred option to resolve any dispute rather than diplomacy. This is reflected very simply in the reality that the United States of America, which produces 40% of all the military equipment produced in the world, employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And the United States of America today has 11 aircraft carriers. A further and obvious consequence of the trade in weapons and the warfare that it gives rise to would be seen in the current catastrophe that is Yemen, where there is an appalling, illegal, specific targeting of innocent civilians, over 15,000 of whom have been killed, at a time when the United Kingdom, the United States, and a number of other European governments continue to sell billions of dollars to the aggressors in that conflict. Besides the almost incomprehensible suffering on the ground, what the Yemen conflict has done is indicated the extent to which national law, multilateral agreements, and even the International Arms Trade Treaty that was only passed in the United Nations in 2014 are regularly ignored in the name of national security. And of course, when one thinks of the issue of sustainability, I wonder, outside of the natural resources sector, and particularly fossil fuels, whether there is any industry that has more devastating consequences on our environment. I once interviewed an executive of a leading defense manufacturer who informed me that they were in the process of producing a green bomb. A bomb that would kill people, but would do so in a manner that was less damaging to the environment. A few months later, when I phoned her again to check on the progress of the green bomb, she informed me that they had abandoned the project because to produce environmentally friendly bombs was simply too expensive. When we now think about the future of warfare, the future of conflict with the sort of technological developments that we are seeing. The reality is that killing from a distance, be it through the use of drones or autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, biochemical warfare, raise all sorts of new and additional moral and philosophical issues.
Andrew, I know you're very good at talking.
Thank you. Can I have 30 seconds?
Yes.
Thank you. The reality is that while the modalities of warfare might be changing, the politics and economics that underpin the trade remain very much the same. And this includes the reality that weapons often land up in the hands of non-state actors, and with these new technologies, that threat and danger is further exacerbated. So let me in conclusion say that it is my opinion that the role of science and the role of scientists in this process needs to be, first of all, to identify the manufacture of weaponry that is not fit for purpose. The best example of which I don't have time to get into, the new F-35 jet fighter. But the second and perhaps even more important role is that of truth-telling. Is that of using the scientific method and the scientific process to unmask and reveal the realities of fake news, which I think have always been with us, but are perhaps being seen in their most unadulterated form in our current politics. So the role for me of science and scientists is to put the facts on the table, to impact the realities of warfare, and ultimately thus to speak truth to power. Thank you.
Your turn, Joe.
Thank you. I also would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to take part in this session. And I want to begin my remarks by noting that we are in the middle of an anniversary year. This is the 100th anniversary of the 1918 flu pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. Accurate figures are very hard to come by, but it's generally accepted this was a truly global pandemic that affected something like a third of the world's population. 500 million people at the time became infected. Up to 50 million people died. Some estimates are as high as 100 million. And again, this was global. 500,000 in the US, 250,000 in the UK, and as many as 17 million in India. This was the deadliest pandemic of modern history. And the question that haunts flu researchers in the global public health community today is, could it happen again? I would also add, and if it did, would it be natural, accidental, that is resulting from the inadvertent release of agents being studied in the lab as part of the global effort to prevent that pandemic? Or could it even be deliberate? There's a powerful norm, international norm, against the use of disease as a weapon. So it does make these weapons or different from the arms trade. The combination of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the Biological Weapons Convention, which was the first global disarmament treaty to ban an entire class of weapons, and I would also add the Chemical Weapons Convention, provide a comprehensive global ban on chemical or biological weapons. That means, among other things, that no country today admits to having a biological or a chemical weapons program. But they did. So we sometimes, I think, forget that within the last 30 years, even after the adoption of the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, there were active state programs. As many as 24 countries over the years have had biological weapons programs, including South Africa, through a program known as Project Coast. My introduction to biological weapons issues came with the former Soviet Union, when in early 1992, President Yeltsin acknowledged that the Soviet Union had maintained a huge illicit biological weapons program. And I was involved through the US Academy of Sciences in efforts to engage and find constructive alternatives for the scientists who had been involved in that program. And in particular, I met the director of the Soviet Union's illicit virology laboratory, Vector, in Novosibirsk, which was outside Novosibirsk. And he was a very good scientist. And one of the, let's say, interesting features of Vector, the lab in Novosibirsk, was that it was also the laboratory that was one of the 2 remaining acknowledged repositories for smallpox, which by then had been globally eradicated, with only stocks remaining in the United States Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and at Vector. So at one and the same time, here was an internationally recognized research laboratory and the cover for a massive, part of a massive illicit biological weapons program. So these weapons are real, the concerns are real, even though we are blessed that we have not had the use of biological weapons in conflict since World War II. Most of what we've experienced would fall in the dimension, if you will, of biocrimes. Chemical weapons, sadly, are being used today. We can talk about that further in the discussion if you'd like. But I think it's important to stress that these are weapons that have existed in recent memory. The knowledge of how to produce them remains, some in the open literature. And to that, I now want to turn to the fact that we're in the midst, as many of you are aware, of an absolute revolution in the life sciences. It's impossible in some ways to grasp the pace and the scope of the change. It's, and sometimes it seems almost as though it's a science and technology tsunami coming at us and the challenges that this can pose for policymakers. And it's positive, it's offering hopes of meeting global challenges in health, in economic development, in energy, in the environment. It's almost impossible to overstate the hopes, some of them perhaps too great, that are being placed in what biotechnology will allow us to do. And these are hopes not, I want to stress, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world as well. That's very important, and the investments are there and the progress is there. At the same time, these developments have, perhaps not surprisingly, also raised concerns that all of this research, all of this new knowledge are going to yield tools, techniques that could somehow either provide new bioweapons, enable bioterrorism, or perhaps enable even lone wolves, small groups of individuals to carry out biological attacks. And that's for, I think, for this group, the major tension. How do we ensure that we can take advantage of these developments for peaceful purposes, for the hopes that they bring, but at the same time avoid the security consequences? People often talk about balancing science and security, and I don't like that. I want both. I want security and I want science, and to be able to advance and produce positive developments. And I think that takes a different mix. And since Andrew ended on the role of scientists, I want to add a couple of others. Because my work now, and the work of a number of colleagues who are here, is about engaging scientists in the efforts to ensure that the developments in the life sciences and chemical sciences and technology going forward, now and going forward, will continue to be used for peaceful purposes. One is to engage scientists in helping policymakers understand what's happening in the sciences, what the implications are, both for science and for policy. And you have to acknowledge that most policymakers, and particularly not international diplomats, have much experience with the life sciences. Being honest, most of them survived a single university course in biology and have never looked back. So that one thing scientists can do is help understand, help translate what this means for the community. And another very important one, which I think is particularly relevant to a forum like this, is to uphold this norm. To uphold the norm against the use or misuse of science. And that's through organizations like a number of those who are represented here, is a particularly important opportunity, and one which perhaps I can close with that. And I'd love the opportunity to explore in the Q&A some of the things that are going on through networks of academies, through other kinds of organizations, to try to ensure that the norm, this incredibly important norm, is not broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Andrew. So, Andrew, in the clip you just showed, there's a gentleman who was saying it's okay to kill from a distance. And that couldn't be more ominous, especially at this time when there's an effort to even militarize space. But keeping it down to earth at the moment, I think many of us journalists will tell you that we witnessed that conflict after conflict, in the sense you're standing in the battlefield and there's actually no battle happening. It's all raining from the sky. Now, the damage is the same. The suffering of the people is one constant, regardless of these new ways of conflict. So, you know, one does wonder, why all this? Why this continuous development of more and more sophisticated weapons? To what purpose? And how much does the defense industry have to do with that?
I think there are a number of reasons why that occurs. The first is for policymakers, and particularly for politicians. the stand that they take is that they're keeping us safe. And I suppose if they can announce, develop, be seen to be championing new ways of doing that, there is a political benefit for them, first of all. Second of all, the economics, very simply. Weapons makers are constantly looking for ways to diversify their product suite, if you will, especially if production costs are significantly smaller and profit margins are significantly higher. So, for instance, with the manufacture of drones, what we heard from a number of commentators was, oh goodness, well, drones are much cheaper than a jet fighter or an aircraft carrier. But what the industry has very cleverly done is it's created what are known as technologically gold-plated drones. So drones that are individually incredibly expensive, but that are also sold en masse. So where a country might buy 20 to 25 jet fighters, they would be buying 300 or 400 technologically very advanced drones, so that the economics continue to work for what is described in the film as the national security elite. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, in order to bolster one's position as a politician, it is not a good thing to have body bags returning to one's own country. And to have methodologies of warfare that put your own soldiers and your own citizens at less risk is obviously politically, and they would argue humanly advantageous. I would argue that within that calculation, it requires a degree of dehumanization of those who are being killed. But the reality, if again, and I'm using the example of drone warfare, which in this context is certainly not the most advanced of the technologies by any means, but it's one that most of us can relate to. The reality is that the impacts on those engaged in the warfare, so for instance, the US drone operators sitting often in a base in a desert somewhere in the United States, pulling the trigger on people thousands of miles away from them. The psychological devastation on those people is also profound. And there's an extraordinary new film that is based on an interesting study. The film is called National Bird, that speaks to a number of drone operators, whistleblowers, who talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder they suffer from having given the order for a drone pilot to effectively pull the trigger. So even though you go home to perhaps your suburban life, the consequences of being involved in warfare remain fairly profound, even if your life is not in immediate danger. So those are two of the most profound reasons, I would argue.
Okay. And John, you know, the other side of the conflict is, or new ways of conflict we want to put, is that we're facing these transnational groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all elusive. We see them in videos, they scare the whole planet, but nobody really knows much about them. So politicians can say whatever they want. Now, we've been hearing over and over again about the Al-Qaeda operative or the ISIS operative with his long beard traveling around the world with a suitcase carrying some sort of nuclear, biological, or whatever. So you, as a scientist, how much do you buy that argument? And is it so easy, really, for such groups to be able to reproduce such chemicals and weapons?
First, unfortunately, most of what is really known is behind the classified curtain. The ways in which you gather, the investigative journalists and intelligence people are really our sources of information. So just to lay that out.
But as I said,
But I just want the context that we're dealing. There's an element of speculation, no matter what.
Okay.
For an audience like this, we don't know.
Okay.
It's not that easy. It depends on what you want to do. If you really talk about trying to have a militarily useful biological weapons program, that's complicated. Just having the biological agent is the bare beginning. You need to be able to weaponize these agents. You need to be able to put them, say, in bombs. You need to have something to deliver those bombs. It's much more analogous to the kinds of programs we're talking about here for major defense industries. You're preparing for war. And those existed. I mean, the one that always shocks me was that part of the purpose of the Soviet biological weapons program was to have bombs available filled with things like plague that could be launched after a nuclear war to be sure that the survivors would now be subject to yet another new horror. So that's difficult, a militarily significant program. You could certainly cause some level of casualties, and there are scenarios with pretty much just the agent. If you think about the health and the economic impact, say, of the outbreak of SARS in 2003, of the Ebola crisis, just given the nature of global travel these days, there are ways you could produce less a weapon of mass destruction than a weapon of mass disruption. And as these technologies are becoming cheaper, more globally dispersed, more accessible, we are going to need to worry more, I think, about enabling small groups, even terrorist organizations, to carry out these lower level attacks, which could be serious and harmful and erode the norm. Again, against this, because so far, at least in the case of chemical weapons, there has not been accountability for the modern use of those weapons in the Middle East in the 80s and again.
I think the crucial dimension is that anything that can be monetized is likely to be available in its initial form to almost whomever can afford it.
I have to say, when during the fall of Mosul and all that area, so we were with the Kurdish forces advancing, in any city or any village that was evacuated, ISIS had fled, you would find sometimes these small labs or these very big labs in Mosul. What we saw is like very primitive missiles made of pipelines welded with some sort of canister on top of it, and we were told that they were using chlorine in that.
Yes.
But yes, it's damaging, it's destructive, but it's not so sophisticated at all, whereas the conventional weapon capabilities of reproduction of this group was quite impressive. I mean, they were producing rockets and mortars at an incredible rate. When it came to chemical or anything like that, it was very, very primitive. Anyway, there's a gentleman who wants to ask a question.
Jeffrey Wilton, University of Edinburgh. Do you think that autonomous systems controlled by learning algorithms add an extra dimension to all this? Just let me say a couple more things. Firstly, such systems don't need a controller sitting in Texas somewhere to deliver something somewhere else. All they need are one or two very general rules, and systems themselves have the capacity to evaluate the setting, to make decisions about how weaponry of whatever sort, whether biological or in the form of a bomb, might be delivered, and in broad terms, how strategies might be deployed too.
I mean, as a non-scientist, the notion of that sort of autonomy absolutely terrifies me, because I think that conflict and warfare, as I suggested earlier, often has a dimension of dehumanization involved in it. But there is the human dimension, which makes dehumanization difficult. When one's talking about autonomous systems, one removes that altogether. In addition to which, there are places in the world where there are what are described as, depending on your perspective, either some sort of separation barrier, which can be described as protective or as offensive, that have some autonomous weapon systems within them already. Now, this is, I mean, at a much more basic level than you're talking. But already we're seeing with those sorts of systems that they can effectively go out of control. And we've seen an instance where, for instance, small children near such a barrier that has autonomous weapons, who have not understood the messages coming from those autonomous weapons, have continued to walk towards them and have been killed as a consequence. And we are told that there is no control over that fairly basic autonomous weapons system. Now, if one takes that on a far larger scale, the sort of thing that you're looking at, I personally think that the consequences of that are absolutely terrifying. So again, it becomes enormously important that scientists are in a position to inform policymakers of what the real dangers of these sorts of developments are, and attempt to ensure that there is appropriate regulation of these sorts of scientific developments. And what worries me about that is how remarkably unsuccessful I believe we've been at regulating mainstream conventional weapons. So it raises very real concerns for me.
Yeah, Joe, how much of a conversation is it in the scientific community about this concern of dual usage and how to try to limit it and how to regulate it, or what is discussed?
Well, in the science, there's a huge discussion in the artificial intelligence community. And what's interesting to me, and certainly the UK is the case, there are also conversations within the military about the implications of autonomy. And this may be one case where there are actually possibilities for, there's a technological drive, because artificial intelligence is developing so quickly. There are technological pushes to use it, but I find that many in the military are not certain that you want to surrender the autonomy. That it's an important part. What does command mean if you don't have control? What does it mean for discipline? What does it mean? So this is a moment, but there's a major conversation in the science community and the artificial intelligence community. Huge concerns. There are both Oxford with its Institute for the Study of the Future and Cambridge with the Center for the Study of Catastrophic Risk, and now aren't those encouraging places to be? I have a colleague who's working on species extinction as a potential global, but there are places where these conversations are being held, and it's very important. I think it's important that they be encouraged, because this is a case where the technology push is incredibly rapid, and if there isn't action soon, there could be control. You could lose control of the debate.
Go on, sorry.
But you wanted to ask me about biological?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there is maybe a feeling among some scientists that maybe things are going too quickly and too far, and it must be a dilemma, because your role and your passion is to find new things.
Yes,
but it must be also scary.
Yes, and there's very much a debate. It's contested in many parts of the scientific community. I started by talking about flu. If you every year there's an amazing global process led by WHO to try to figure out which strain of flu is the most risky for this year, and then develop a vaccine. And flu is an interesting case because flu keeps mutating and evolving, so it's always a guess. And we still make flu vaccines in chicken eggs, so it's a slow process. And the efficacy of there's no universal vaccine, there's some antivirals. And the efficacy of the vaccine that is selected, say, in the early part of the year and administered in the fall is sometimes 30, 40%, depending on the segment of the population. That gives you a tremendous imperative to try to push as hard as you can to figure out what it is that actually makes flu so deadly. What are the risks of particular strains of flu moving from animal populations where they reside to being able to infect humans? But how far do you go? And just in trying to figure that out, what are the risks that you could pose by an experiment on enhancing the transmissibility of a virus by increasing its pathogenicity? And in fact, the scientific community has been consumed since about 2011 in debates over whether or not some experiments by flu researchers really were appropriate. But it's very much contested, partly because of just this imperative sense, and for other things like energy development or food security. It's not easy, because the scientist's sense of self is they got into this for good, for glory, for other things, but for good. So it's not easy, but it is going on.
Okay, and at a certain point, there's also the issue of accountability, right? So let's take an example of Syria. Everybody says Bashar al-Assad has to be held accountable for the chemical attacks in eastern Ghouta and other places. But would that ever happen? It rarely happens. And B, would he be the only person to be held accountable, but also maybe all that network that made that weapon available to him in the first place, because he didn't produce that?
But I suppose the issue of accountability in the arms trade broadly defined is a huge problem. It's not just a matter of the impunity of which I spoke, but it's also, as you're implying in your question, it's that accountability is partial, and accountability is determined by our own worldview. And one has no body, no entity that could impose that sort of accountability. So part of the thinking around the International Arms Trade Treaty was to attempt to impose some sort of global accountability. However, it has absolutely no enforcement mechanisms, and it's entirely dependent on the individual nation states. So we're back to square one, despite having the treaty. So when you take a particular incident, first of all, the facts are always going to be called into question, depending on who is pronouncing on them. Then the actual entities to provide that accountability simply don't exist. I mean, only recently we've been reminded of the problems of the International Criminal Court. So imagine trying to impose that on the notion of conventional weapons, let alone the sorts of things that we're talking about now. I think it is fraught with difficulty, and I think it raises very serious questions for a whole range of issues around global governance. Because obviously accountability has to be central to global governance, but we're still grappling with the problems of global governance, let alone the accountability dimension.
Well, ironically, and sadly, one can argue it's the Iraqi people who paid for the alleged weapons of mass destruction program of Saddam Hussein.
I mean, that does remain a huge problem in that, within the arms trade at the moment, you have this extraordinary situation where the biggest recipient of weapons from the countries of the West have relationships with some of the groupings those countries of the West are supposedly involved in this ongoing battle against. So all of these sort of obfuscatory issues just show the immense complexity of it all.
It does indeed. There's a question.
Thank you, Hoda Abdel-Hamid, CEO, International Science Council. Thank you both for fascinating talks. When we talk about the role of science, I kind of get it when it's issues you're dealing with, Joe, and I'm very familiar with the work you've done for a long time on, through academies, etc., in terms of creating awareness, ensuring that there is scientific understanding, etc. But Andrew, you picked up, you talked about underlying institutions and practices of bribery and corruption. What on earth can science do against that?
Yeah.
What is the role of science, or is that about public action? If so, how can scientists help through campaigns, and through collaboration with organizations like yours, to promote and drive such campaigns? Is that realistic? And what can we do in terms of those underlying practices and institutions that are so pervasive and so powerful?
I think that's a superb question. I think a very important one. The one area, and here I'm talking with a degree of ignorance, so forgive me, but the one area in which we have seen the role of science and scientists intersecting with the role of ordinary people and activism and campaigning would be the domain of climate change, I would argue, at least to some extent. And I think the role of science and scientists there has been to make accessible the science of the issue in such a way that it can actually motivate and inspire ordinary people to take action. Because when we think of what you describe as all of those underlying activities, the reality is that a lot of this is done in the name of ordinary citizens, and often utilizing their tax dollars or whatever currency they're paying their taxes in. And it astonishes me, and maybe it's the after effects of growing up in a country like South Africa at a particular time in its history, where the country was so deeply politicized at almost every level, where to not engage in politics was a profound political statement. I feel the same about all of these issues that we're talking about, because they have such enormous impact on the world in which we live. They're being done in our name. We are funding them. And I think the role of scientists and of science in this is really to try and make accessible what are very complex issues. And as the ultimate in non-scientists, if I could voice one plea, it would be for scientists to focus on the accessibility of the work that they do, or to ensure, because I know that sometimes the people who do the work are maybe not the best people to communicate it, that they work with people who can make that transition from an academic or scientific community to ordinary citizens. And so when it comes to the issue of corruption, the most important thing is exposure, hence the secrecy. The greatest challenge we face is to overcome the secrecy. And here I think the role of science and scientists has to be more accessible, to themselves open up to scrutiny.
So, what I find fascinating in my small career is that whereas before wars were territorially contained, now, because of scientific advancement, they just can happen, as you said, someone can be sitting in the US throwing a drone in Afghanistan, someone can be sitting in Qatar. And so that is very scary, because at a certain point, how do we stop that? And should the scientific community, can it actually, rather than should it, try to find some sort of mechanism that can regulate the extent of which advancement can be used in military? Is that even possible, or is just me talking in a very utopian way? I don't know. I really don't.
Let me see if I can. Certainly in the case of biological and chemical weapons, you do have international agreements and treaties in place which are based on science, whose premise is, in fact, to limit the uses to which certain kinds of science will be put. Even some of the efforts again on conventional weapons are again based on finding ways to put limits on how science will be used. It's getting, the challenge can be making it real. Again, usually these global agreements depend on national implementation, action at the national level. So you need an engaged scientific community at these levels to help see these through. I hope I'm trying to answer that it's in specific areas. And when you look, and it's always a challenge when some new area of technology emerges. Artificial intelligence, again, is the prime example, I think, right now, of an area where there's a shock and struggle to try to figure out what the implications are, what can be done.
These limits, and please add whatever you want, but the limits Joe is talking about, do you get a feeling that they're for everybody or for certain countries? And that's maybe also part of the problem here.
I would argue that they are for everybody. Some of the complaints about, say, export controls, etc., are more political than they are real. I think if you look at my experience, say, with the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva and listening to diplomats from some countries, is they don't know what's going on in their own countries, frankly, in terms of the level of science capacity, scientific activity, that, yes, there are limits and there are a lot of the traditional mechanisms have been based on control, denial of access, etc. I think increasingly there is more recognition that in areas like life sciences, chemistry, that's not a winning strategy, that it's cooperation, management that's going to be necessary. And they're quite fascinating. You can have, usually a little more off the record, fascinating conversations with any of the major weapons of mass destruction machines, the people in International Atomic Energy Agency or the BWC or the Organization for the Prevention and Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, about this movement for management cooperation more than attempting to deny access or believing that you could somehow deny access. But there's a great traditional political value, as you know, particularly in the UN system, of for claims of denial and discrimination, which have an element of reality but tend to be fairly vast, fairly exaggerated. Let me try to say that a little more diplomatically.
Just one thing I'd like to add to that is certainly in the arena that we do our work, the big obstacle we constantly come up against is that of national security.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we must have made freedom of information requests in literally dozens of countries. And we're wondering what the sort of world record is for having freedom of information requests turned down. And the reason for that is simply this is a matter of national security, therefore we can't make the information available. Now, quite clearly, there are legitimate areas of national security and defense that should not be in the public domain. The problem we have, especially at a time when it's my personal opinion our politics are particularly tawdry, and I would say that that's in many parts of the world. National security can be used to hide all sorts of things, including in relation, for instance, to corruption in the arms trade, basic criminal conduct. And I do think that therefore the imperative upon scientists or people with knowledge is also to have to consider in certain situations the very uncomfortable prospect of having to blow the whistle.
on activity that is being kept secret for national security reasons, whereas in fact, the importance of it being made publicly available outweighs the national security imperative. And we've seen, I'm sure that the current administration will probably surpass this, but under Barack Obama in the United States of America, more national security whistleblowers were prosecuted during the Obama administration than in all previous presidential administrations in history. And I think that to me only suggests that whistleblowing in this type of context is becoming more rather than less important.
Okay, there's a question there for you.
Yes, Alberto Martinelli, University of Milan. Can you comment about the role of organized crime in the weapons trade? Thank you.
It's sometimes the sort of boundaries that I try to draw between the so-called legal and illegal, which are extremely fuzzy, suggest that within that mix, organized crime plays an incredibly important role. So for instance, individual intermediaries, be they arms dealers, agents, or brokers, which all have slightly different functions. I mean, the boundaries between those people and broader organized crime networks are again extremely fuzzy. I mean, there's one particular person who I've been following probably for 8 or 10 years now, who went from being a fairly conventional arms dealer based in Switzerland to now being based in a Balkan state and at the head of a remarkable organized criminal network, of which the Prime Minister of the state in which he lives is a beneficiary. So I think that these sorts of arenas are more and more being intertwined. And that, of course, raises all sorts of difficulties, both for investigators, for journalists, but also for scientists, because one can find oneself involved in something that one had hoped in one's lifetime one would never have to engage with. But I think it is a reality that people need to be aware of.
I want to pick up on the whistleblower issue, just to note that there is awareness in the scientific community of whistleblowing issues. The most recent UNESCO statement on responsibilities of science includes an explicit provision calling upon scientists who discover misuse of science, I'm paraphrasing, to report, to take action. The statement on biosecurity, which is principles for codes of conduct in 2005, also talks about protection, both the responsibility to speak and the need to have provisions to accommodate the Hague Ethical Guidelines through the organization that was facilitated by the Chemical Weapons Organization. So there's a recognition. It's difficult. It's extremely difficult, but there is a there's a recognition that I find very encouraging of this kind of responsibility. I think it comes in a broader context of scientists increasingly seeing science as part of society, that there is a social contract between science and society, that it is more, that scientists have a responsibility for more than simply doing the best possible science. That's a change. It's somewhat generational, if I were to say. But it's real, it's important, and it's something I think we need to be taking more advantage of. It's certainly something that academies of science are trying to take advantage of. And I am going to abuse a moment just to say that one of the really encouraging things I have seen in the last couple of years was the response from the scientific community, but also from industry, to the use of chlorine as a weapon. Because there are, and you can find these there was a joint statement from the American Chemical Society and the American Chemical Council condemning the use of chlorine. The European Chemical Society, which happens to include Israel and Turkey, have condemned the use of chlorine. The president of the Israeli Chemical Society wrote to Netanyahu saying it was past time for Israel to join the Chemical Weapons Convention. The African Council of Chemical Societies has condemned the use of chlorine, and that brings in Egypt, who's a non-signatory to the CWC. It's remarkable because chlorine is the ultimate dual-use, multiple-use chemical. And there were experiences in the past in Iraq when chlorine was first used as a weapon of trying to limit exports of chlorine, which led to outbreaks of cholera because chlorine is a vital element in water purification. So for me, this is also an example for the Sustainable Development Goals, of a way to illustrate the multiple uses of chemicals and the need to manage because they have this essential nature. But I'm very, and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, to its credit, given the political nature of this, has these statements on their website and accessible, and it's something that I think is a very good example of where, in an obvious way, the scientific community and industry, in this case, for practical self-interest in part, but also out of a genuine ethical concern, are trying to take some action. And I think enabling scientists to speak in areas where they have particular authority is a particularly important arena.
I think it's probably important to have scientists sitting at the same table as politicians and more other things when important decisions are made, and probably their voice should be heard before taking any decision. There's another question there at the back.
Yeah, I'm Sue from Australian University. I'd like to return to an earlier topic that you raised about the extent to which these matters are, which are fascinating discussion, thank you, are active matters of debate within the science community. Joe raised the things to do with looking at flu, but there are other examples. For example, one of the people who developed one of the new and emerging gene technology or gene editing systems actually promoted debate about concerns about their use, which led to combined efforts by the US and Chinese and UK academies of science to debate these issues. There are other examples of academies producing reports on the implications of the use of gene drives, and more recently the academies of the US Academy and IAP and the European Science Advisory Council convened a meeting of regulators to look at governance and dual use. So very active discussions, as Joe alluded to. One of the things that is common to virtually every one of these discussions is a general consensus that whilst debating the science, and in that context it means the natural science, the biological science, is desperately important in terms of understanding implications. The role of social sciences in terms of both encouraging scientists to engage in proactively being aware of these issues and acting upon them, but also the broader communication with the community in terms of decisions about how these technologies are used. Every time, the conclusion is always, yes, the social sciences could be helpful in this. But it's a level of arm waving right now. And I'd like, Joe, I know you've been thinking of this, to perhaps in this, the World Social Sciences Forum, to unpack a bit how it is that you think the social sciences may be able to contribute. There are as many disciplines within the social sciences as there are in the natural sciences, and I think we forget this. And I'd like you to extemporize on that, please.
All right, very, very quickly, for example, in ways in which social science can and is contributing. is in various approaches to identifying and assessing risk. How do we know that a new technology, any new technology, poses, and I'm particularly fond of an area called decision science, which draws on social psychology, behavioral economics, certain kinds of statistical analysis, but what it enables in the forms I particularly like are more systematic, more transparent discussions in which you keep pushing your experts about the assumptions they bring. Because very often when you hear experts debating, you don't necessarily know the assumptions that are underlying these assertions that they are making. And so there are methods, well-established methods from social sciences that can help you structure a debate and really keep pushing and pushing so that you can understand. It doesn't always lead to consensus. It may simply make clear what are the true points of disagreement, but then you can think about how to work around it. We know there's currently a great fad in talking about what we need is a culture of responsibility in the sciences. And we don't always know what culture is, but there are people who study culture, both how individuals behave in organizations and how organizations themselves study. And the Canadians, when they were doing their new regulations on human pathogens, actually had an anthropologist who studies laboratories as a culture, advising them on what a laboratory is like as opposed to a more structured element. There is a whole field now that's very exciting, that would be interesting, and much of it familiar to journalists, called the science of science communication, which draws on unders from the media, from cognitive linguistics, from sociology, from social psychology, from political science, to understand how people process and receive information, that simply providing more information is not necessarily useful or helpful. That people process their cognitive maps, their ways, frameworks through which people process information. And if you want to structure a debate or a social conversation, that's an essential set of understandings. How issues are framed. This would be totally familiar in the media. Do I get to define the issue? Are these autonomous weapons or killer robots? There's a framing issue for you. So this is another area that's really valuable. So those are just some examples, but I think social sciences have a great deal to contribute to addressing these kinds of issues. And so I'm delighted to see the new merger of ICSU and the International Social Science Council, and I hope this will facilitate more of that kind of dialogue.
So we're nearing the end of this panel, but I'd like to just, the last few minutes, talk about the future and go back to what we said at the beginning, this idea of militarizing space, especially that President Trump seems so keen about it. Andrew, is it something we're going to have to worry about in the near future, in the middle future? How far is it? And Joe, that won't be able without a great input from science. How do you guys feel about it?
I'm concerned for the same reason I'm concerned about all of these issues. One of the questions was about those underlying issues of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. I remember I was a student in the US at the time of President Reagan's Star Wars initiative, and I happened to be at the University of California at Berkeley, where the Star Wars laboratories were based. And And it was something that there was always the perception that this was never going to work. And everybody knew it wasn't going to work, but nobody was saying so explicitly, because there were literally tens of billions of dollars that were dedicated to it. And so everybody saw a huge opportunity in what was, in my opinion, political and defense-related madness. And I fear that the weaponization of space, there's going to be that element to it. But then I fear even more that there's going to be an element to it that will be very real. And it's something that from a regulatory perspective, but also from the perspective of the politics and economics of it, I think we have to watch extremely carefully and ensure that there are people appropriately analyzing the sorts of statements that politicians are making and raising the concerns in some of the ambitions that are being stated.
Yeah, because science is also a monopoly of certain countries in this world, and they will be the ones going to space.
Yes, although the monopoly spread, I mean, space is an extreme case, but if you look at life sciences or
An
other
extreme case
yeah.
is becoming reality. I mean, at least by what we're told. I don't know. You can give us an input on how feasible that is.
Weaponization of space has been an issue for quite a while. It is becoming more feasible, but there are also political I don't know how well we can play on these. There are enormous political interests in not weaponizing space, for example, because of the dependence on satellites for communication. There are cross pressures. It's our ability to find ways to make those pressures more effective. And I will say scientists in the US and Soviet scientists together spoke loudly against the Star Wars program. I work for the US National Academy of Sciences. I think there is a reason we were never asked to provide a technical assessment of Star Wars.
Why did you speak against it? What's your major concern?
The major concern was that this was an unnecessary potential escalation of conflict, and, oh, by the way, it wouldn't work in those days, that it was an unnecessary, and you have organizations like the American Physical Society and others who were on record. It depends on the issue. I mean, again, when you're talking about this revolves around nuclear weapons policy. I think you've seen a more, if I will, principled debate in the science community around the issues of nuclear weapons than you have seen in the conventional arena, being frank. I think that's just, it's been in the nature of the trade. And again, especially with chemical and biological, these are not legal. There are, this is not a little of this, a little of that, which is the huge dilemma in the arms trade, is these are recognized as legitimate for defense, for law enforcement. So you're always trying to figure out, well, what within this space is it appropriate or proper, unless it's landmines or cluster munitions or something where you can achieve a ban. You're wrestling with the day-to-day dilemmas, I think.
Any more? There you go.
So I'm Sharifi with Hiroshima University. Speaking of future, I would like to ask, how do you think climate change will affect the dynamics of these all wars and conflicts, and in terms of also the arms trade? Do you think it will affect the dynamics of arms trade?
I think, Andrew, see what you think. I think the dynamic would be climate change affecting conflict then bringing a connection to the arms trade. And there's a great deal of concern about the degree to which climate change, particularly certain aspects of climate change, may in fact exacerbate conflict. And ironically, in the United States, two of the major funders of research about climate change are the US military and the US intelligence community, because they are the ones who will have to deal with, in one way or another, the aftermath. It's water is a good example. There are at least arguments that it was drought in Syria over a number of years that were pushing certain groups into cities, were one of the underlying currents in the efforts to overthrow Assad.
That certainly happened in Deir ez-Zor, which is an area where ISIS had a very strong presence. I had been to that place before ISIS arrived, and it was being basically eaten up by the desert. And people were in a very difficult condition, and the government was more absent than present. And I think that created the condition that people did embrace the group, hoping that the group, using the tactic of winning hearts and minds in the first few weeks, we fix your little lamppost and we bring you some food, and then we take control. And I think that really helped a lot. And climate change was definitely one of the issues, because people had no survival mode anymore.
I mean, the one thing that occurs to me is, I think, if one looks at the myriad conflicts in Africa through the 80s and 90s in particular, while there were obvious geopolitical factors that contributed to those and historical colonial factors, there's no doubt in my mind that issues of climate change certainly exacerbated the situation and was a contributor to some of those conflicts at least. I think one other point, not only that I think issues of climate change can be very important contributors, and I worry particularly about a country that's very close to my heart, because my wife is Bangladeshi. One looks at the situation of the impact of climate change on Bangladesh. But I think also in turn, quite obviously, we have a vicious circle in that conflict, I think, obviously exacerbates climate change, especially when it continues for a long period. And as we see the changing natures of conflict, and we think about biochemical, et cetera, I think that those sorts of impacts are going to become even more devastating.
Well, on that happy note, as Antonio Guterres says, it is a bit gloomy looking ahead. Thank you very much, Andrew and Joe. It was fascinating. Thank you for coming so early to listen to all of this. A good start for the and have a good rest of the day.